Okay, it looks like we are live. Let me just make sure the sound is working this time. um, Sorry about that a few hours ago. Um, the software I used it last time and it worked really well. Um, Let me just confirm that I am actually live. There we go. Sound's on. Good. Let me know if the sound ever cuts out. So anyways, the software that I use that I connected through Facebook through their API. I last time there's this little switch that you have to toggle to turn on the sound, and I forgot to turn it on. So sorry about that. I was laughing about it the whole way. I went to go pick up my wife and come back. I was laughing about it. It's kind of a silly little mistake, but we're back. Here's part two, I guess, of was Karl Barth a Universalist? So we'll get into it. I wanted to talk today about this question just because it's a question that comes up quite often in discussions of Barth's theology. People often ask about it. It's one of the first questions people ask when in regards to, in discussion groups or whatever else. People tend to ask this question. Let's see here. There we go. So I just wanted to talk about it today. By answering this question, I would like to read a chapter where I discuss it directly from my book, which is Karl Barth in plain English. In case you don't have it, I put a link onto this onto the top of this description. So if you haven't got it, feel free to pick it up. But this is a chapter that I'm particularly proud of. It's one that people have mentioned is one of the highlights of the book for them. And so I want to just read through the whole chapter, like I said, where I discuss Barth's relationship with Universalism. Hey, and so just to give a little bit of background about myself in the book, like I said, my name is Stephen D. Morrison. I'm the author of this book. If you watched our last video, I did it probably about a month ago actually now, and that was about really just diving into some of the ins and outs of the book, my process more in writing the book. So if you're interested in how I ended up to write the book, you can check out that video. It's on my Facebook page. So go ahead and watch that. I have posted it on YouTube and stuff as well. But generally speaking, I wrote this book as an amateur to other amateurs. I wanted, other people to be able to engage with Barth on a level that's more approachable than some of the resources that are out there. There's plenty of good introductory books. I won't deny that as well. But I wanted to take it. There's very few that are written by amateurs themselves. Most of these are professors or scholars that have spent many years with Barth, and I have spent a good amount of years with Barth, but I'm no professor. I don't have a PhD, and all these things. So from that perspective, I hope the book kind of resonates with people. And so that's just a little bit of background about the book. And then let's get into the topic right away to this one, because like I said, we delayed a little bit if you're just joining in because of a little technical error, a very silly one, an embarrassing one, where I talked for 25 minutes and there was no sound. So sorry about that again. But this question of Karl Barth and Universalism tends to come up in relation to Barth's doctrine of election. So I want to briefly talk about that first. Typically especially if you come from more of a Reformed background, more of the Calvinist background, you would hear something from Barth. You'll hear about his doctrine of election, and maybe the first thought in your mind is, doesn't that automatically equate to Universalism? And the answer is essentially no, it doesn't automatically equate to it, which we'll get into that more. But personally, I didn't come from that perspective. I came from more of like what you call the Arminian, the Methodist kind of point of view. And that's really initially what attracted me to Barth, was his doctrine of election. I had, come to appreciate Calvin and come to appreciate the doctrine of grace, especially within the Reformed tradition, not only Calvin, Torrance, and other guys like this. And so I came to appreciate that doctrine of grace, but at the same time, I couldn't necessarily swallow the traditional form of it within Calvinism, where you have the elect and the reprobate on this two different sides of things. And God's determining who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, all this stuff, which I necessarily couldn't swallow. That's still something I obviously don't agree with at the moment. But that's what initially led me into Barth, into studying Barth, was this this interesting doctrine of election that I had heard that he had formed, and kind of something new and something really interesting. And so, but typically when people read the doctrine of election, the first thought, from whichever perspective, really is, what does this mean for universalism? And so for that, I'm going to read a chapter from my book where I dealt with that. It's a few pages long, so it'll be a little bit of going through, but I'll pause at some points to kind of emphasize different things. If there's a quote that's directly from Barth, I will note that as well. But this is a chapter called Sidebar. I have these sidebars in the chapter which follow after chapters, major chapters. So this one follows after the major idea of chapter 5, which is the God of election. And then shortly after, like I said, I have this sidebar which just kind of addresses more contemporary questions after the major ideas, after the chapters. And so this one's on universalism. And so obviously, like I said, that's why I introduced with the doctrine of election, because it naturally follows into this. And so I'll read the whole thing, like I said, and I'll clarify some points when I need to. Okay, so Barth's doctrine of election raises the critical question of universalism. If we confess that all are elected in Jesus Christ and through him made covenant partners with God, doesn't this automatically mean the confession of universal salvation? Barth's response is unique. Many have tried to force Barth to say either yes or no to the question of universalism, but in reality he says both yes and no. While at once he doesn't necessarily say both yes and no, he says it a qualified yes and no. Just to clarify that sentence, Barth argues for the negation of dogmatic universalism and the negation of dogmatic particularism. We'll look at 3 key examples from the Church Dogmatics, Volume 2.2, the important collection of essays, The Humanity of God, and Church Dogmatics, Volume 4, 3.1, in which Barth directly addresses the question. Okay, and so the first subheading, Church Dogmatics, Volume 2.2. Many have falsely claimed that it is a logical necessity following the doctrine of election for Barth to affirm universal redemption. But Barth explicitly denies this is a logical necessity. Under the heading, The Determination of the Elect, from section 35 in CD 2.2, Barth explains why such a conclusion should be rejected. Essentially, Barth argues that the extent to which the circle of salvation includes only some or all of humanity is determined only by Jesus Christ. Universalism is a question only God can answer, and one day will answer in freedom. Barth therefore writes, and this is a direct quote, "It is Christ's concern what is to be the final extent of the circle. If we are to respect the freedom of divine grace, we cannot venture the statement that it must and will finally be coincident with the world of man as such, as in the doctrine of the so-called universalism. No such right or necessity can legitimately be deduced. Just as the gracious God does not need to elect or call any single man, so he does not need to elect or call all mankind. His election and calling does not give rise to any historical metaphysics, but to the necessity of attesting them on the ground that they have taken place in Jesus Christ and his community. But, again, in grateful recognition of the grace in grateful recognition of the grace of the divine freedom, we cannot venture the opposite statement that there cannot and will not be this final opening up and enlargement of the circle of election and calling, neither as the election of Jesus Christ, the election of the community, nor the election of the individual do we know the divine election of grace is anything other than a decision of his loving kindness. We would be developing and opposing historical metaphysics if we were to try to attribute any limits to the loving kindness of God." And that's from Church Dogmatics 2.2, pages 417 through 418. These are my comments. Barth considers both alternatives, either the limitation of God's loving kindness, which is the absolute rejection of universalism, or the answering of a question only God can answer, which is the absolute acceptance of universalism, to be abstract speculation and therefore of having no part in the task of dogmatics. Furthermore, Barth sees the question of universalism as one that only God and freedom can and will answer. Therefore, it is forbidden for us either to limit God's love by declaring salvation only for some, by rejecting universalism, or the opposite, to force God's free love into including all in that circle by affirming it as a fact. Then in the next section, we talk about a quote from The Humanity of God. The same line of reasoning is further clarified in Barth's small volume, The Humanity of God. Barth asks this in the light of God's unequivocal affirmation of humanity. And this is a direct quote. Does this mean universalism? I wish here to make only 3 short observations in which one is to detect no position for or against that which passes among us under this term. And then the first point, one should not surrender himself in any case to the panic which this word seems to spread abroad, before informing himself exactly concerning its possible sense or nonsense. And that's from The Humanity of God, page 61. And that part there where he talks about, I wish here to make only 3 short observations. We'll go through each of those, but he says that in these you can't detect either a position for or against it. And so I think that's his, it's a clever way of, he's often trying to, Barth wants you, we're kind of going off here, but Barth once used an analogy where he said that theology is like describing a bird in flight, a bird in this motion, because God's not the dead God. God is the living God. He's always on the move. He's this God whose being is in becoming. And so I think this kind of comes back to that in some sense, where Barth's often, he's very passionate about keeping the freedom of God. And that's just really a sense of making sure that we remember that God is the living God. We can't close him into a dogmatic system where we control what he does or why he does it. And so that's why I think he makes statements like this very often. And it's really important to understand kind of that background for his answer to universalism. So let's continue. Get a little water. I have my Barth mug again, since we're having a Barth discussion. Might as well have the mug to go with it. So continue on. These are my comments. In other words, let's not be too hasty in rejecting universalism as complete nonsense, or from the opposite perspective, as the only possible answer, as complete sense. Universalism shouldn't create an immediate fear-based reaction from us. I can't help but think here of the American evangelical community and their response to the mere suggestion of universalism found in Rob Bell's now infamous book, Love Wins. Barth would tell us not to panic at such a suggestion. Barth continues, and these are the next 2 points. 2. One should at least be stimulated by the passage, Colossians 1:19 through 20, which admittedly states that God has determined through his Son, as his image and as the firstborn of the whole creation, to reconcile all things to himself. To consider whether the concept could not perhaps have a good meaning. The same could be said of parallel passages. That's from page 61 to 62. And then these are my comments. In other words, Barth points to Colossians 1:19 through 20 as a scripture which, among others, should at the very least open us up to the possibility of universal reconciliation. We cannot be so quick to discount such a passage or to limit its importance. And finally, Barth's third and critical point, this is a direct quote, 3, one question should for a moment be asked, in view of the danger with which one may see this concept gradually surrounded. What of the danger of the eternally skeptical, critical theologian who is ever and again suspiciously questioning, because fundamentally always legalistic and therefore in the main morosely gloomy? Is not his presence among us currently more threatening than that of the unbecomingly cheerful indifferentism or even antinomialism to which one with a certain understanding of universalism could in fact deliver himself? This much is certain, that we have no theological right to set any sort of limits to the loving kindness of God which has appeared in Jesus Christ. Our theological duty is to see and understand it as being still greater than we have seen it before. That's from page 62. I'm just going to pause again, because that's probably one of my favorite quotes, if not ever, from Barth. That's a really great quote in general. Just that I just love that we cannot limit. We have no theological right. We have no ability in our theology to limit the loving kindness of God. Our only theological duty is to see and understand it as being still greater than we had seen it before. And I really love that. That goes back to that bird and flight analogy that we just talked about, where Barth's very insistent on keeping the living God free in himself. And so I really love that. But we'll continue on. So these are my comments. These last two sentences are critical. Who are we to limit the love God has for sinners in Jesus Christ? Not only is it more cheerful to have hope in this possibility, but it is a serious error to absolutely reject it by imagining God's love inherently has such a limit. We limit God's love and freedom if we have determined ahead of time in our minds to exclude the possibility of universalism. We may wonder about this question, but we have no theological right to limit God's love. Barth is right. Our theological duty is to see and understand God's love as being still greater than we had seen it before. This answer is characteristic of how Barth addresses the question of universalism. With the freedom of God in mind, Barth opposed both dogmatic universalism and a dogmatic rejection of universalism, that is, of particularism. This is one of the reasons why Barth was notoriously difficult to pin down. This non-answer was Barth's typical reply when asked about universalism. He would say, I don't believe in universalism, but I do believe in Jesus Christ, the reconciler of all. And that's from Bush's biography, page 394. Or Barth would sometimes cleverly say, I don't teach it, but I don't not teach it. In this sense, we could say, being careful not to place any labels on Barth, that he was a kind of hopeful universalist, who at once rejected the logical necessity of universalism, but also the logical necessity of particularism. For Barth, ultimately the question of universalism is one that only God can and will answer, and we risk the prideful attempt of playing God whenever we try to answer it ourselves. This is God's question, not ours. God, as the one who loves in freedom, will one day answer it. We may hope for it, but we cannot teach it as dogmatic truth, either in the affirmative or the negative. And then next section, this is CD 4 3.1. So we read a quote from that. We'll now examine one final place where Barth makes a similar twofold response to the question of universalism. This comes from the end of CD 4 3.1, literally on the last page, under the heading The Condemnation of Man in section 70. I want to bring this passage to your attention because here Barth explains why there remains the possibility of some being eternally condemned, just as much as there remains the possibility of none being condemned. If this passage is understood correctly, the false claim that universalism is a logical necessity of Barth's thought would be removed. For Barth, we're up against the mystery of iniquity, of sin and evil, which has been called the impossible possibility or the ontological impossibility. Sin as human falsehood, as lying, is our attempt to turn truth into untruth. This is the doctrine of sin in CD 4 3.1. Barth discusses the condemnation of the individual who lives in this impossibility, who attempts to turn the truth of their reconciliation in Jesus Christ into an untruth, thereby condemning themselves. It is in this sense that there remains the possibility of a populated hell. These individuals who pervert the truth of God into falsehood may suffer the consequences of their falsehood, and therefore suffer the judgment of God which they no longer deserve. Their choice to live in untruth may ultimately end in their condemnation. This is a self-contradicting, impossible possibility of condemnation of God against God's unequivocal affirmation of their existence in the election of Jesus Christ. In this context, Barth writes, to the man who persistently tries to change the truth into untruth, God does not owe eternal patience and therefore deliverance. That's CD 4 3.1, page 477. In other words, God does not owe the sinner who persists in their own self-condemnation any hope of final deliverance. But in spite of the fact that God does not have to deliver and turn towards the sinner with patience and mercy, Barth notes, and here's a direct quote, there is no good reason why we should forbid ourselves, or be forbidden, openness to the possibility that in the reality of God and man in Jesus Christ there is contained much more than we might expect, and therefore this is supremely unexpected withdrawal of that final thread. That is, in the truth of this reality there might be contained a superabundant promise of the final deliverance of all man. To be more explicit, there is no good reason why we should not be open to this possibility. CD 4 3.1, page 477 through 478. We cannot count on this possibility, but we must hope and pray for it. As Barth continues, if we are certainly forbidden to count on this as though we had a claim to it, as though it were not supremely the work of God, to which man can have no possible claim, we are surely commanded more definitely to hope and pray for it, as we may do already on this side of this final possibility. That is, to hope and pray cautiously and yet distinctly that in spite of everything which may seem quite conclusively to proclaim the opposite, his compassion should not fail, and that in accordance with his mercy, which is new every morning, he will not cast us off forever. That's from page 478. The key context for understanding Barth's answer to universalism is prayer. We are commanded to hope and pray for the salvation of all, because universalism is a question we have no right to answer in ourselves. If we demand a definite answer to the question of universalism, we try to become like God. But in prayer, we humble ourselves and rightly acknowledge God's goodness and freedom to save. Barth commends the latter against the former. Prayer takes precedence over the demand for certainty. Now I'll pause for a second, because that's personally one of my favorite sections that for me has helped me the most for kind of understanding Barth's relationship with universalism and his doctrine of election, was right there, just kind of seen within the context of prayer, is I think central. Barth's very reformed, so he doesn't necessarily talk a bunch about his prayer life or prayer, but I feel like this was a very important part for Barth, the issue of prayer, that it came down to we should hope and pray for it, but we cannot assert it as a fact. Okay, and so continue on to this last section. This is under the heading, The Tension of Scripture, with a quote from Bruce McCormick. So, Bruce McCormick helpfully explains Barth's answer as the attempt to remain faithful to what the Scripture actually says on this issue and how it says it. That is, to speak of the tension between history and eschatology. It is Barth's dedication to the Scripture which ultimately stands behind this twofold answer. Barth was attentive to the fact that the Scriptures hold this paradox, this tension. On one side, there is scriptural hope for universal reconciliation, and on the other side, there is the possibility of a populated hell. Where most try to resolve this tension, Barth allows the tension to stand. McCormick writes, this is direct quotes, I think there are good and sufficient reasons not to eliminate the tension, but to allow it to stand. I also think that both traditional Calvinist and traditional Arminian exegesis misfire at precisely the same point. Both treat the propositions found in Scripture as standing in a strict logical relationship to one another, so that any tension that might exist among them must finally be regarded as a contradiction, which would obviously threaten biblical authority. My own view is that the tension I have identified is not rightly understood as a contradiction. Rather, it is a function of the tension between history and eschatology, between time and eternity, between certitudes and mysteries, between what may be said with great definitiveness and what must finally be left open-ended and unresolved. That's from McCormick's essay in Karl Barth in American Evangelicalism, page 430. And then last few sections here. Barth speaks this twofold answer not because he was afraid of the term universalism, he warns against such a reaction, nor because he was secretly a universalist and spoke in code, which some have tried to claim Barth as a closet universalist. Instead, Barth speaks about universalism in this way because this is the way Scriptures speak of it. We can and should hope for universal reconciliation, but we cannot teach it as dogma. To ultimately teach it as either fact or to reject it as a heresy is to attempt to resolve this tension within the Scriptures, either towards one position or the other. This makes human beings, ourselves and our logic, the determining factor in this answer and not God and His freedom. It is in this sense our prideful attempt to play God as we try to resolve this tension, because it is our attempt to take away God's freedom to answer only what He can and will answer by answering it ourselves. Okay, so that was it. That's the end of that chapter from my book, Karl Barth in Plain English. I hope you enjoyed my reading of it. Hopefully I didn't mumble too much. I try not to. Go ahead and post any questions you might have in the live video, and I will get to them here in the question and answer, but I just wanted to kind of do a quick summary of everything. So I think for Barth, like I said, the context of prayer is probably the core idea. Same for the scriptures, what I talked about there with McCormick. And I think a lot of people, I think there's a tendency in Western theology to try to resolve a lot of these tensions. There's not much, because Western theology kind of operates with this this strict logical connection between things. They have there's a difficulty in our culture to let mystery remain. We don't allow for things to remain unsolved. We don't like unsolved things. We like resolutions, and we don't like cadences that leave us on our edge. And so I think the question of universalism, the way Barth does it, people have tried to say, oh, he's actually saying this, when he very explicitly denies. I think, in my opinion, he's very, very clear on his answer to universalism, but a lot of people have tried to kind of muddy the waters and say, oh, actually, when he says this, he can't say this because in somewhere else he said this, and they try to connect all these dots that I think there's an importance to, if we read any theologian, not just Barth, if you read any theologian, to take their word seriously. If they say something about their own theology, obviously that's what they were intending, even if you could read something else technically by it. I think it's important to kind of understand that concept of things. And so Barth very, very explicitly made it clear that he, had this twofold answer where he didn't think we should be dogmatically universalist or dogmatically particularist. And in that sense, I think he was quite clear, and that's what I hope to show in this chapter. Like I said, I showed through those 3 different key quotes that are quite long quotes, and very important quotes too for the section. But they all pretty much said the same thing, that we can't place limits on God's loving kindness, but at the same time we can't say absolutely that this is the way it's going to be, that we would know the end, that got that circle of salvation would open up for all. And I know there's some logical difficulties between reconciling that and election, and I think that's where I think it's helpful just to kind of take Barth at his word. Not that I think that I don't actually subscribe to the idea that there's a contradiction for that in Barth, but I do think that's what people have tried to show. There's some essays I've read that are really well put together essays, but I think they just fundamentally fail to just listen to what Barth actually says about his own theology and how he interprets it himself. And so hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that's kind of a good taste of the book as well, if you haven't been able to pick it up yet and read it. I'm not seeing any questions yet on here. So I'll make a last call then, and then we can be done. Any questions about either that subject or about the book in general that I'd be able to answer? If not, we can call out a night and be all set from there. So it's looking like there isn't anything. So I guess I answered all the questions, or nobody's willing to ask questions. But anyway, thanks everyone who joined in. I appreciate all of you. Those of you who have read the book, who have given me great feedback, who have told me they've enjoyed it. I appreciate that. And so I'm very grateful for all of you that have done that. I want to give you guys a heads up. Next week, if you are still delaying to get the book, next week, our friend over at the Post-Bardian, Wyatt, he's going to be doing a giveaway. We're giving away signed copies of my book to people. There'll be 3 of them. He'll be signing off, or he'll be giving away on his blog and stuff. So keep an eye out for that. If you still haven't gotten one yet, be sure and check that out, and hopefully you can win one as well. But if not, if you just want to get it now, feel free to buy it. That's always good. But if there's not anything else, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for stopping by, and hope this was helpful. And I will see you next time. All right. Bye. Have a great time.